Lawrence, the Lonely Viscount. An Oxford Cottage inspired story vignette, written by Leenie Brown and narrated by Christopher, a cloned voice made available by the voice actor through the Elevenlabs library. Author's note: this scene was written shortly after I completed writing Oxford Cottage. Lawrence Fitzwilliam, Viscount Brantworth, is the heir to Lord Matlock from that novel, and the proposal to Elizabeth that he mentions in this vignettes is one of the Path to Oxford Cottage stories that begin and set the stage for the novel. Will you guess the identity of the other lady about whom he thinks in this contemplative scene? Loneliness was an interesting feeling. It was not always an unwelcome or unpleasant feeling, but it was always interesting. Lawrence Fitzwilliam, Viscount Brantworth, bent his right leg and propped his left foot atop his knee as he pondered his loneliness. His arms were crossed behind his head, performing, somewhat satisfactorily, the duty of a pillow, and the breeze blew softly, making the leaves of the tree under which he lay tremble slightly, as the long grasses tipped their hats to him. He closed his eyes and drank in the tranquillity that surrounded him. This was what he needed. He needed to be alone, to withdraw from life for a few brief moments and contemplate in lonely seclusion, far away from the house, past the edges of the formal gardens, hidden in the rolling countryside and filled with a quietness that was welcoming, comforting, restorative. Silently he drew in a breath, held it for a moment, and then slowly let it go, along with the lady who was now his cousin. He had known she would never be his, but to have her married, and so happily so, did sting just a bit. There was not another like her. He was nearly certain of it. How many years had he been parading through the seasons with nothing to show for it but a little more apathy, a bit harder edges, and a heart that seemed less and less touchable? He sighed. There were others, not as lively as she, but acceptable and perhaps even lovable. He switched legs, propping his right foot on his left knee. Did he even know what it was to feel love? He had felt strong, protective feelings for Elizabeth, but were they really any greater than those he had for his own sisters? He doubted it. He found her attractive, that was different from how he thought of his sisters, but attraction did not equate to love. If it did, then he would have been in love with nearly as many females as he was years old. So, no, finding her beguiling to any degree did not mean he was, or had been, in love with her. He had been saddened when she had refused his offer of marriage, but he had not been shattered. He had not even felt melancholy. Truth be told, he had actually been somewhat relieved enough that he had almost wholly sworn off all strong drink so that he would not find himself in such a situation in the future. No, he had not loved her, not in the way a husband was to love a wife. He had loved the idea of her, the thought of someone who would always be eager to listen and share his deepest concerns and greatest joys, of someone who could arouse a feeling of desire for her, to improve himself, to expand the space within his treasured solitary moments to include a lifelong companion. He swatted at a fly that buzzed near his ear. Annoying creatures. They were not unlike some of the ladies of the ton, buzzing and flapping about with no purpose but to drive you to distraction. His thoughts of bothersome females in general paused as he returned his hand to behind his head and turned his mind to one lady in particular, on the outer edges of the ton, who piqued his interest. She could buzz and flap with the best of them. He had watched her do so in many of the finest rooms in London. He knew that her performance was to garner the attentions of his cousin Darcy, for he had, on more than one occasion, seen her glue herself to his cousin's arm and babble on about things of no importance. She had pursued his cousin, it was true, but not with a soul-deep longing for the man himself. There had been disappointment when she learned of his cousin's betrothal, but there had been no headaches or other complaints of malady that bespoke a lovesick heart. Her pursuit, quite obviously, had been for position and wealth. She had been chasing a means to rise above who she had always been, and she was the sort of woman from whom men of his rank ran, a fortune hunter. He rose to a sitting position and stretched out his legs while leaning back on his hands. Was that all the interest she had in him? Had she spent hours with him as they waited for news of Elizabeth and Georgiana's safety, just to engage his interest with an eye to acquiring his money and title? He shook his head. No, she had not pursued him. He chuckled. It was rather startling that she had not. His rank and bank accounts were both better than Darcy's. However, though he knew she knew that, she had never crossed the room to sit beside him. She had never laid claim to his arm in the manner she had with his cousin. Instead, she had waited for him to approach her and for him to offer his arm. He had seen her eyes follow him around a room, only to dart away when he looked in her direction, and she'd coloured in embarrassment. When he'd engaged her in conversation, her speech had, on several occasions, faltered, a rarity for her, for it was something that he'd never witnessed happen when she spoke to others. Perhaps... A faint ember of hope ignited in his heart. Perhaps she felt attraction to him as a man and not as a viscount of substantial fortune. Of course, attraction was but one part of choosing a marriage partner. His father had made sure that all his children knew that fact, and Lawrence knew that if he could not prove to his father an attachment beyond attraction, his father would not give his blessing to such a union. Be that as it may, her attraction to him was nothing at which to scoff. It was, after all, a first small move toward the eventual loss of his current single state, if said attraction could be proven to be for more than his present and future titles and fortune. He stood and smoothed his clothing, making sure to remove any leaves or blades of grass that may have attached themselves to his jacket or trousers. His sojourn in solitude had done its job. His mind was ordered. Any dust of uncertainty or confusion had been swept away, and a possible path to a happy future stretched out before him, without a hint of fog to shroud it. He gave his appearance one final appraisal, and being assured that he looked presentable, he strode to his horse and took his seat. Slowly, he nudged his mount into a steady canter. He looked back down the fence line of the adjacent field where his brother and cousin often rode as if the devil were in pursuit of them. He shook his head at the foolishness of such a thing. He was certain he would never understand the need to race forward, whether on a horse or in a relationship. A steady pace, calm and assuring, which would keep solidly to the prescribed path. That is what he needed, was it not? He turned his horse toward Netherfield, and so too did his outlook. He chuckled to himself. Loneliness was indeed an interesting, shifting feeling, for the loneliness that he had sought, along with the peace that it had brought and the clarity of mind that it had helped him achieve, had in an instant been replaced by a dissatisfaction with his current state and with a desire to leave a certain type of loneliness behind. Impatience accompanied this loneliness, and it compelled him to urge his horse to gallop more quickly. There was a lady of interest whom he wished to know better, it said. Now was not the time for a leisurely ride in the countryside, it prodded. A laugh escaped him as he felt a longing to allow his horse to chase the wind back to the wedding breakfast, and nearly gave in to it. Loneliness was fickle indeed. Not only could it provide tranquillity, but it seemed it could also provide the motivation necessary to pursue what might surely become a pleasantly sanguine state of being that mere solitude could never provide. Thank you for listening to Lawrence, the Lonely Viscount. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please help other readers find it by liking this video and sharing it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be notified when I upload another video. The 2023 copyright for Tales from Pemberley and other sweet story vignettes, in which Lawrence, the Lonely Viscount, can be found, is held by Leenie Brown. All rights reserved. The narrator for this story has been Christopher, a cloned voice made available by the voice actor through the Elevenlabs library.